Hi, I'm Charlee Simons. That didn't really mean anything to you, but about a year ago I moved up here to Calaveras County. I live in Valley Springs. So I'm looking through the Calaveras Enterprise newspaper, right? And I see this guest speaker coming to this place called the Calaveras County Senior Center. I'm not quite old enough to be hanging out at a senior center yet, but I was really impressed with all the things they have to offer. The meal program, things for veterans, volunteer center, Habitat for Humanity. They got ARP, they got ILAP, they got HERC, and they have other things that sound like belches. All kinds of initials. You know, I don't know why. Government programs always sound like belches to me. HIP, HOC, HEAP. So anyway, they had this guest speaker. Her name is Linda Clark. Now she's a local author. She wrote a book called The Small Window, and it's about everything I love about this area. The history. The gold country history has always been fascinating to me. Even since I was a little kid, I've been really into all that stuff. So I came to see Hard Luck Lin, that's her character name, otherwise known as Linda Clark, the author, at the Senior Center just recently. I brought a camera, I taped the whole thing for you, and that's what I'm going to show you in just a second. Now you will see some what they call archival footage, which is basically a fancy way of saying old pictures. I got them at this place right over here, the Red Barn Museum. If you haven't seen this yet, it's in San Andreas here as well. It's awesome. As a matter of fact, let's do a quick look over there. I'll meet you there. Come on. Just off Highway 49, it's called Mountain Ranch Road. And this is it, the Red Barn Museum. Do yourself a favor. Bring the family, bring the kids, bring yourself. Check it out. There's some great history here. So again, let me introduce to you now, ladies and gentlemen, for your dining and dancing pleasure, local author Linda Clark from her book, The Small Window, better known as Hard Luck Lin.
Now there's some of you here, you know, we's danced but we ain't shook. So I was going to have to take care of that right away. Folks that's wanting to be talking with me call me Hard Luck. And them that don't, there's just a bunch of no counts, if you catch my drift. Now I don't think that Hard Luck is such a bad name. It just means that I keep trying, no matter what it is that come my way. And hard luck's a whole lot better than no luck. Ain't that right? And it's a whole sight better than bad luck. So when them fellas out there call me Hard Luck, I say, how do you do? How do you do? Now, I have to tell you this, it's kind of crowded in here, but if there's some of you that's real hungry for all this here history and you want to hear it right away, as soon as it comes out of my mouth, you can come right on down here to the front because you're going to hear it before them folks there in the back are going to hear it. Okay? I'll wait for you if you got a mind. Now, before I tell you about the history, I got to know how much it is that you already know. So who can tell me when gold got itself discovered right here in California?
1848. 1848. January the 24th, 1848. Wow.
You want to know? Yeah. You want to know? Okay, now listen up. This is real important. You can pass it on down to your grandbabies. The Miwok knew about the gold. They knew about the gold long before man ever got here, but they didn't have no use for it because it's too soft to make into tools, too soft to be making into weapons, so they had no use for it. Then there was a fellow long about the mid-1600s, and he come out here and he found out about the gold. Now his name was Sir Francis Drake, and he was one of them fellas that just loved the water. He loved to sail around in that water no matter what it was that he was doing. He was in that water. Now, folks, I do come from what was going to one day be Minnesota. And back there, if you got a name like Drake, you best be like in the water. Thank you. Thank you. Now, the most favorite thing that he liked to do was to go and bump his ship up against one of them Spanish galleons, and he would take all their booty. And so if you was from Spain, you called him a pirate. But he was a smart man, and he loved to give some of them gewgaws, them diamonds and them jewels and rubies and gold and silver to the Queen of England. And she loved that. He knew a way to a woman's heart. And the people in England called him a privateer. Well, he knew about the gold because he wrote about it in his diary. Now, he was sailing around one day and he took powerful ill. And he died. And his friends there was going to give him a proper send-off, so they stuck him in an iron box and threw him over the edge of the boat. They did. They did. And nobody got around to reading that diary. Now, there was another fellow that come through here that knew about the gold, and he was a mountain man. His name was Jedediah Smith. And he come through in the 1820s. Oh, you know, there's a story told about old Jedediah. He was up here in these mountains, and he got himself into a commotion with a grizzly. And before they was done, that grizzly had ripped off half of his scalp. Well, he took to his partner and he says, Clyman, you got to sew it back on. And Clyman says, I don't know how. He says, ain't no different than sewing up your shirt or sewing up your trousers. Now sew it back on. I'll hold real still. So he held real still like this, and Clyman was sewing it back on. And when he got all done, Jedediah looked down, and there was his ear still laying on the ground. He says, you forgot my ear. He says, I didn't know how to stick it on. He says, partner, every living, breathing thing that walks has got two ears, and I'm living and I'm breathing. And I want my two ears. So he did get it sewed back on, but it's kind of hard to tell with all that hair and whatever he wore. Well, he knew about the gold, and he wrote about it. But nobody read his diary either. Now, I do think, folks, that there's something to be said there about liking to read and what you can learn when you read. Well, in about 1842, there was another fellow that knew about the gold. Now, his name was Francisco Lopez. And that was at a time that California was still a part of Mexico. And he was a real smart fellow, real smart. He did all of his learning at the University of Mexico City. And he studied all there was to know about mineralizing. That's what we called it when you wanted to go looking for gold. Now, he had all that learning, but folks, he had no luck. And finally, he had to take to herding some cattle down there in the Placerita Canyon up in the Santa Clarita Valley. You know where I'm talking on? If I said Magic Mountain for the rest of you, would you know where I'm talking? That's right, you just got to have them right words. Well, he was up there one day, and it was getting along about towards noon, and he wanted to sit down and have his nooning. That's what we called it when you took your noonday lunch. Your nooning. We was real good with naming things back then, you see. So he sat down under this real nice inviting oak tree, and he was having his lunch, and he saw these wild onion plants. They was just waving in the breeze like this, and he said, oh, they would be powerful good. So he reached over and he grubbed them up, and guess what was stuck to the roots of that onion? It was gold. It was gold. Now, he told the Mexican government about it, but they didn't pay no never mind. Nobody ever paid no attention. Some folks say that he took out 1,300 pounds of gold, but nobody paid no attention. Well, then we come up here to 1848, January 24th, 25th, or 26th, depending upon whose diary you want to believe. And it was Mr. Marshall and Mr. Sutter. Right, now there's this real interesting thing that lots of folks don't think about. Just 6 or 7 short days after that gold was discovered, the United States and Mexico, they signed the Treaty of Guadalupe Hidalgo. Folks, that give the United States the opportunity to acquire a whole bunch of land. California, New Mexico, Arizona, parts of Nevada, parts of Oregon, and nobody knew about the gold discovery. Now, you think about that. Our history books might not have been written quite the same if they had known about it. Well, word of that gold discovery, it spread. It spread like a wildfire, and pretty soon folks was coming here from all over the world. They was coming from France and the South Sea Islands and Germany and Russia, from all over. But folks, we didn't have telegraphs back then. We didn't have televisions back then. And we didn't have telephones back then. So how did the word get out? Got an idea? How did it get out? Well, let me tell you what it was. You got this here miner, and he tells that there miner, and he says, but don't tell nobody. And that there miner, he told that there miner, he says, don't tell nobody. And that went over there, he told that one way in the back over there. And the word spread. Now out there, back then, we had a special name for that. That's not called a telegraph. That's not called a telephone. And it ain't called no television. We call that teleminer. And it worked. Word spread. It spread. And ladies, this here is for you. This here is pure, positive proof from the annals of history itself that it were the men that were the gossips because we weren't out there. That's right. That's right. Well, gold got itself discovered in all kinds of ways. There was 3 French fellas that was trying to dig up a stump. But owing to the fact that they used just a wee bit too much of that blasting powder, they blew it all over the countryside. But what was left was this big old hole in the ground. And guess what they found down in that hole? Yes. And then there was George Knight up Grass Valley way. He was chasing after his cow one day. It had done run away. And he was a-running and a-running, but he was having himself a real time of it because that cow's got 4 legs, you know, and he only had 2. Well, just as he was about out of breath, all of a sudden something reached right up like this, grabbed a hold of his leg and pulled him down kerplop. Well, when he got back up to see what it was, he went back. And there was this beautiful piece of quartz with a fine ribbon of gold running through it. Yes, yes. And then over here, Carson Hill, there was a company, a group of fellas that come from the old country. And they had a mining claim over on Carson Hill. One of the fellas took sick one day. Powerful sick, and he died. Well, them fellas was so broke up about it because they knew the families and they knew this fellow wasn't going to be able to go home for a proper burying, so they had to give him a proper burying right here. One of them went off to find the preacher and the other ones dug the hole. Well, it was nigh on to getting close to evening time when that preacher come. And that preacher looked upon this as a real opportune moment. And he gathered them around and he started preaching. Well, when time come for him to do the praying, he told them to all get down on their knees. And folks, I do not mean no disrespect, but we all know that there are some preachers who can make a whole sermon out of that little tiny prayer. And that's what he was a-doing. And folks, your knees ain't made to do what the bottoms of your feet are. And he was paining this one fella, something fierce. And so he decided to take his mind off of it, and he started playing with the dirt. And he found some gold. He jumped right down in that hole and he stuck a claim in his partner's name, of course. He did. He did. And then over in Agua Fria, there was this fella named Sherlock, and he shot a deer. And he was following the blood trail because he ain't killed it yet. And as he's following this blood trail, all of a sudden, he sees nuggets on the ground. Nuggets on the ground. And pretty soon, you got Sherlock Flats, you got Sherlock Falls, you got Sherlock Town. There's Sherlock all over the place. That's right. And then you folks did hear about old Stinky Severs, didn't ya? You all know old Stinky Severs, he had himself that claim over there on San Domingo River, you know, or creek, or whatever you call it. You know, he's that fella that don't believe in doing his personals. He says it's just a waste of time because he's just going to get dirty again bucking in the dirt. Why, he don't even keep a lick of soap about the place. None at all. I'll tell you, these times when we're working on downwind of him, we get to hoping he's just going to fall in, boots and all. Well, he was working his claim just the other day, and whilst he was gone, into his camp come this big old purty polecat. Now you know what I'm talking on when I say polecat. It's one of them little black critters with the white stripe on him. You know, it looks like he's carrying a pole. That's what we call him, a polecat. Well, this polecat come a-calling. Got right into Stinky's larder, he did. Made himself to home. When Stinky come home that night, there sat that polecat making like he owned the place. Well, them two, they had themselves a real commotion. And before it was done, old Stinky was nailing a polecat skin to the side of his cabin. Now, that would have been the end of things, excepting for the fact that all of a sudden, Stinky's eyes started watering, and his nose was a-running, and he was smelling something most intolerable. And no matter what he did, he couldn't get upwind of it. Finally, what he figured, he was smelling himself. That's right. That's right. And he had to shuck right out of that shirt and right out of them drawers until he was standing there wearing nothing but his drawers and his boots. And still his eyes was watering. And still his nose was smelling something most foul. And folks, not meaning to be disrespectful, there ain't no way of saying this, he had to shuck right out of them drawers until he was standing there naked as a jaybird. That's right. Now that's where the problem become, because you see, Stinky didn't have another pair of drawers to be putting on. And he had to find a way of getting them drawers clean. But owing to the fact that he did not have any soap, he had a real dilemma. Well, he thought and thought and thought, and finally he says, I know what I'm going to do. I'll take them drawers and I'll tie them up again the snag that's out there in the middle of the creek. The water will wash through them all night long, and come morning time, they'd be smelling sweet as a rose. So that's what he done. Now that would have been the end of things, excepting for the fact that up there in the high country, they had themselves a real gully washer. And folks, you know that water's got to go somewhere. And most generally it do run downhill. And that's what it did all night long. Them waters washed on down the hill, and the creek rose up. And that morning when old Stinky went down to get his drawers, they was gone. They was washed away. Now what was the man to do? He knew the proper dressing demanded that you put your drawers on first, then your trousers. And there's lots of things that Stinky was not, but being a proper dresser was one that he was. And so he could not put his trousers on less than he had them drawers on. So he had to go looking for them. Well, I tell you, when he walked past our camp wearing nothing but his boots, we was hooting and hollering. We was. But then we heard him a-hooting and a-hollering. So we run on down there to the river to see what it was. And there was old Stinky, and he had a hold of them drawers. They was still caught up again that snag, and that snag had caught up against some rocks. And he was pulling them like this, and pulling them like this, and pulling them like this, and dragging them, and they was so heavy, he could barely move them. Finally, he got them up there onto the shore, and he started untangling them, you know, and unbuttoning them for to be putting them on, you see. And when he opened up them drawers, there caught up in the seat was more yellow rocks than he ever saw in his whole life. That's right. That's right. He said right then and there, if he'd have known that doing his personals was going to make him a rich man, he'd have been doing it 6 Sundays a month. That's right. Well, here's another story. You ever hear of a fella named Henry Angels? Well, one day Henry Angels was coming on down here into the southern mines. And he come to this real pretty little inviting creek, and there's some nice oak trees there. So he sat himself down, and he was going to have a nooning. And it was a nice restful spot. Now, he got to paying attention. He was seeing all these folks going north and south and north right by him. And then he was watching all these people go east and west and east right by him. And he says, you know what? I bet this would be a real good spot for me to set up a little trading post. So that's what he done. And pretty soon, that place grew, and they wanted to have a name for themselves. So they said, let's call this Angel's Camp. And we'll call this Angel's Creek, because we was real good with naming things back then. You know we was. There was a place called Dry Town, and it only had 26 saloons. That's right. That's right. And there's a place called Yankee Jim's, and it was named after a fellow what come from Australia. And there's another place called Volcano, and it don't have no righteous mountain at all. Not at all. Well, Angel's Camp grew. And one day there was a fella in town, and his name was Benninger Raspberry. Benninger Raspberry had a mercantile. And when people was finding gold, his business was thriving, and he was making lots of money. But then as the gold started to dry up, folks was moving someplace else, and nobody was coming into his store. So he says to his wife, he says, "Wife, we got to do something. We're losing our business. We got to find something that everybody's going to want that nobody else has." And folks will come into our store to get it, and then they'll see all the other wonderful things that we have, and they'll come to our store, and we will make a lot of money. But what could that one thing be? Well, they thought and thought, and finally he says, "I got it. Let's get us some brandied peaches all the way from New York City." Now, you know what brandied peaches are? Oh, yeah. Yeah, you know what they are. You just take them peaches, cut them in two, take out the pit, stick them in a jar, and pour brandy on it. So them brandied peaches got on board a boat. And they come all the way down around the coast, all the way around Florida, all the way down around South America, all the way back up to San Francisco. Then they went on up to Sacramento, and then down to Stockton. And then they got on board a buckboard and came on into Angel's Camp. And folks, this took a long time. And by the time those brandied peaches got into Angel's Camp, they was spoiled. Spoiled. Now here was poor old Benninger with all these spoiled peaches. And what's a person to do? Throw them out. It's the only thing you can do. So that's what he done. Now he had a garbage heap right outside his back door. So he dumped all those peaches onto that garbage heap. Today you folks call that a compost heap, don't ya? That's right. We called it garbage. Well, now that would have been the end of the story, except for the fact he forgot that up there in those hills around Angel's Camp are wild pigs. And there is nothing that a wild pig likes better than something that is sweet and spoiled. That night, all these pigs come down out of the hills right there to his place. And they was a-rootin' and a-gruntin' and making noises and a-eating. Why, them pigs thought it was Christmas morning. They did. Now, what is going to happen when you got a whole bunch of pigs eating spoiled, brandied peaches? They got drunk. They got drunk. All over Angel's Camp, you had drunk pigs. Now, a pig knows that it ought not to want to be around somebody like us. But when you are drunk, you don't know that. And them pigs was every place. They was in the parlors, they was in the tents, they was digging up the gardens. They even said they got into the church. Yes. Now, Benninger was not a very popular merchant in town, as you can well imagine. Now, there's another story told about Benninger. One day he decided to go camping. Oh, hunting, excuse me, he went hunting. And he took his gun along, and along about the middle of the day, he come to this real nice inviting clearing with a real nice inviting rock. So he set himself down, and for whatever reason, I do not know why, he decided to clean his gun in the middle of his hunting trip. Now, most folks, when they go hunting, they clean the gun before they go, or they clean it when they come home. But this was Benninger Raspberry, and he was cleaning it in the middle of the day. Well, the ramrod got stuck down the barrel of the gun, and he could not get it out. He tugged and he pulled and he tugged and he pulled, and it would not come out no matter what he did. Finally, he took the stock and he stuck it right down here between his knees, and he clumped on really hard, and he was trying to pull it out this way, and it would not come out no matter what he did. Well, he could not go back to town with the ramrod stuck down the barrel of his gun. Folks would laugh at him. Well, he sat there a moment thinking, and then he got this idea. He put that gun right up here onto his shoulder, and he aimed it off across that clearing. And some of you know what's going to happen, don't ya? What's going to happen when you got a ramrod stuck down the barrel of a gun? It's going to explode, and guess what's right up here where it's going to explode? Well, old Benninger, he put that up here like this, and he started to slowly squeeze that trigger. And you know, there's a whole lot of us that think that maybe he had an angel sitting on his shoulder, seeing as how he was from Angel's Camp. I don't know. But he pulled that trigger back here like this, and that ramrod flew straight and true right out of the barrel of that gun, right straight across that clearing, right smack dab into a big old bunch of manzanita. Thwump. So he went over there to pull it out, but it was stuck. It was stuck. He couldn't pull it out no matter what he did. So he got out his knife and he started digging. And you know manzanita's hard. And he couldn't cut it. So he said, I'll start digging up the roots. I'll dig up the roots. And when I dig up the roots, I'll loosen it up and I'll be able to pull that ramrod out through the back way. So he dug all afternoon. And pretty soon, folks, the sun was beginning its downward climb there in the sky. And he says, okay, I got to try one more time. I'm going to try one more time. And he grabbed a hole really hard. And he started to pull, and he started to pull. His face was sweating and turning all red. And he pulled, and he pulled. And all of a sudden, the ground just let go. And he fell down kerplop on his back. But when he opened his eyes, he realized he was still hanging on to the manzanita root. And guess what was stuck to the roots of that manzanita? Gold. Now that is what the old timers say started the second gold rush in Angels Camp, which is the reason that Angels Camp was there when a fellow by the name of Samuel Clemens come calling one day. And he heard this story about a frog, and then he wrote about frogs. And when you go to Angels Camp, there's frogs all over, and they's big. They's big. Yeah. I got me one more story. Some folks asked me if I would tell. Do your nether regions think they can handle one more story? Okay. Let me tell you this here story. I got to tell you about my friend. I had this fellow I knew. His name was Charlie. I tell you, old Charlie. Charlie could shoot straighter. He could cuss louder. He could chaw harder, and he could spit farther than any other yahoo I know. When Charlie was up in that driver's box of that Concorde stage and he held them ribbons in his hand, I tell you there were none better. One day I was back there in the mercantile and I heard all this goings on out there in the street. So I went out to see what it was that was going on. And somebody had taken a double eagle and flew it right out there into the middle of the street in the dirt and the dust, and all these fellas was lining the sidewalks on either side, and they was having themselves a stagecoach driving contest. You see, some of them drivers, they was betting who was going to be the best stage driver, and if you was going to win that bet, you had to drive your wheel across that coin. Now, they said that shouldn't be too hard. After all, they did have 4 wheels and there was only 1 coin. But you know, folks, sometimes the bragging on something and the actual doing of it ain't the same, is it? And try as they might, them drivers, they could not run across that coin with any of their 4 wheels. And then I heard all this commotion right on down the street. And I looked. And there was old Charlie up in the driver's box of that pretty Concorde stage, all red with them bright yellow wheels, and he was a-coming right on down that street like the hounds of hell were right after him. And I tell you what, that front wheel straight across that coin, that back wheel straight across that coin. There weren't no driver better than old Charlie Parkhurst. Well, I guess I started in the middle of the story, didn't I? Most generally, when folks are wanting to be unknown on someone, they want you to start back towards the beginning. So I guess that's where I better go. Now, Charlie was not one to talk much about himself. But I'll tell you what I can tell you. Charlie got himself born back in 1818 in New Hampshire. He never knew his ma, he never knew his pa. All he knowed was growing up in an orphanage. Now, them orphanages were important, but they were hard places for little ones to grow up in. There was always too many of them and never enough of what they needed to go around. And when them little ones got old enough, they sent them out onto the streets to earn money. 4 or 5 years old, doing whatever they could. And then them little ones brought the money back to the owners of the orphanage, and that's how they kept them dry and get clothes on them. Clothes, all their clothes were exactly the same.